Thank you. I just want to reiterate some thank yous to Musagetes, Kafka, and Guelph Creates for having me here. And I would like to begin with this image that's taken a long time ago, just to give you a little bit of background on my work. And it's taken in December of 2001, and it was on my first trip alone to the desert in the American Northwest, where I was documenting the first and the last light of the day. At the time, I was commuting from Brooklyn, New York to Portland, Oregon to finish school. So anyway, at this point, a year had passed since people in Bolivia had rioted over Bechtel and the World Bank privatizing water. And that same year, there were major floods in 3 places in the world. I grew up in a flood-prone area, so I was conscious of this and disturbed by it. And this is another image where I was interested in capturing and documenting a period between sort of the horror of being in the desert at night and the sublime awe of the sunrise. I should say, at this point in time when I started going to the desert, it was sort of to figure out how I could sustain myself or how capable of survival I was personally. And it's only recently that I realized that in my work and life, I'm sort of constantly searching for this momentary sense of sublime. In this case, I had moved 5 times in 1 year, and it became necessary for me to live with less and less. So I started to work on sort of mobile living and traveling systems for the environment that I was going into and also for my daily life. And I reached out to a class at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to work with me on creating a very simple water purification system. A solution for my travels to the desert, tundra, sort of following this laborious collection process of digging holes near old dried up riverbeds and collecting basically the soil's condensation. So this sketch involves basically taking 3 2-liter soda bottles, empty, and lining the bottom with fabric pouches. And the fabric pouches contain different things from pebbles to carbonized charcoal to iron oxide, all things that I could either make on site or bring along with me. I was trying to figure out how you could sort of live a do-it-yourself, sustainable life as you're always moving, and started to create these sculptural uniforms that I was calling Wearable Homes. And basically they're based, as you'll see as the slides go on, they're based on this investigation into the anthropology of both fashion and architecture, and they consist of 3 layers. So the 3 layers are a subtropic desert layer, the layer that's being worn in this picture, and Arctic, and then a layer for water. So I was focusing on migration, immigration, and as well the hindrances to movement. And I would photograph my surroundings and create sculptural elements to tell a story of a world that was largely based on mobile dwellings. So basically the need to migrate following harsher climates and more tense political situations. This photograph is called Dry Season, and it's taken at the bottom of a dried sea that's now a desert. This photograph is called From Arid Cities, and I think by working and participating in the world of the migrant in these photographs and my life at the time, I'm suggesting that this will be more and more people's realities in the future. So meanwhile, I'm also in New York, and I moved there just before September 11th, and I began documenting every street in Manhattan after September 11th. I moved there to sort of try to do this dual schooling with Parsons in New York and a school called Pacific Northwest College of Art in Portland, Oregon. And the school was closed the entire semester, so I decided that I would walk around every street and take buses when I was tired. And I started looking for visual cues and sort of coming to terms with my new surroundings and visualizing New York as a series of box stores. Or at the same time, I was interested in parking garages and museums and hotels, and I started to map them all. So this is a map of all the parking lots in Manhattan in 2001. And I think I was really interested in New York as this highly charged city in motion. And after moving around the United States and then moving to New York, the stratification of wealth was overpronounced. And I became curious about this dual perspective of migration, one, a forced migration or immigration, versus the global citizen that's flying first class to Davos for the weekend to see an art fair. So at the same time, I'm thinking about companies' pervasiveness in all corners of the world, and I started to delve into this future world where I pictured a new calculation of time based on 360 degrees, and I can elaborate on that later if you're interested. I think it could be very successful. And a new lexicon of words, symbols, and sort of a worldwide Esperanto for post-industry life, and less dependency on the exterior world. So I'm trying to sort of tell this story by collaging photographs that are made as collages and then real. So this is a waterbending station that's a fairly new business in Yuma, Arizona, right on the border of Mexico. And Yuma has some of the hottest temperatures in the United States. But I really think that this sort of thing could be like the McDonald's of the future. We could see them everywhere at some point. So it was very interesting as a structure to me. This is a person wearing a wearable home. It's called Possibilities of Multilateral Communication, and talking on a homemade satellite dish. So I guess reacting to what was around me, I imagined that it wasn't a far stretch from this nomadic post-consumer world where people would busy themselves sort of using and creating adaptive technologies that they make themselves. I think at this point in my work, I'm really starting to blend the boundaries between performance, sculpture, architecture, and photography. And in this photograph, a few friends and I made this sculpture that didn't actually work, but was made from refuse, and then I later made it hopefully look like it worked. So this image is the wearable home in the water, and it's taken in Iceland. This image is completely made from 3D collaging and imaging programs like Bryce and Maya to depict that future world that I wanted to see almost, or didn't want to see. This is a still from a video that shot on the Big Island of Hawaii, and this image is of fissures sort of spewing volcanic steam, and for this video, I basically wanted the narrator to recontextualize the scene. So it describes a place where melting permafrost was a business opportunity, and methane was harvested in this new kind of methane harvesting park. And this may be the future of Alaska. I was interested in the mangrove forest, just as I think they're pretty amazing places for ecosystems to be evolving in. This, perhaps not so far away, future for the Northwest Passage. And this image is called Travel and Life Straw, and it's sort of meant to invoke the Travel and Leisure magazine. This person is using a life straw, so he can actually just drink water from anywhere. And I was fascinated with water purification systems, and this is one that really stood out to me at the time. And I guess I imagine that while our traditional communities were fracturing, the future could be bright, and we could have lots of unresponsive technological friends. And here, I think I'm really asking, like, if people are in this situation, what are the innate creativities that people have when they're on their own and when they're faced with these challenges? So the people in the photographs and in the videos are sort of building nonsensical machines that this one I think looks like it could be harnessing solar power. This is actually shot in Mono Lake in California, the place where there's the most I guess 80% of the birds that live in California are born in Mono Lake. It's very saline, interesting place. This is called Elysian Fields, and basically I was driving in northern Nevada and saw this landscape, walked into it, attempted to capture this image, and then later in my studio I basically just married the structure of this sculpture of this dome to the other part of the image. So the dwelling's just made from leftover wire and plastic. So this is an example of a wearable home from the back. And you can see the wearable home has these automated reachers and receivers. And they basically substitute for bodily touching here. So a person doesn't have to touch another person. And it was kind of the same idea with technology building. Do we really interact with each other anymore? And I think with the wearable home at this point, I'm examining different cultures and groups' clothing throughout the world. So from Inuit to Muslim, Hindu, and Buddhist garments, I'm seeing these patterns and I'm seeing these colors, and that's kind of denoting what I'm making these wearable sculptures out of. And I should also mention that I was working as a guard at the new museum, and it was a pretty boring job. And I would just basically spend my days cataloging what people were wearing. And it turned out that 50% of the people during the summer would wear khaki, so it became fascinating to me, more than it should. So this is a diagram of the wearable home, and basically it's creating a home for a time of even more pronounced rapid migration. And how it works is there's UV protection and solar power is collected. It's stored in batteries. It's collected during the day, stored in batteries, and at night there's a very basic technology that warms you. It's like an electric blanket. It was an electric blanket. And then it got a little bit more high-tech, I guess, and there were sensors that could monitor your body's temperature and keep you warm if you needed to be or cool. And there's a middle section that it can inflate in the water, and the stomach portion can also expand to hold objects of devotion. Or say that's still how we have babies in the future, and then that can expand when you're pregnant. This is a photograph called In the Navel of the Moon, and this is shot in Mexico, and it's a half-inflated wearable home. And this is called inflatable home. So this you could imagine your own personal island. So I think, at the time I thought the future of the wearable home could be downloadable and printed on a 3D printer. It could be cheap and even free. A town could invest in a printer and everybody could print them out. So this is a person building his own island, and this is a person using a Spectus tool to find his home in a world where maybe all the islands are looking the same. So I think the tools are important, and to me they speak of a utility and a lack of utility at the same time, and they remind me of laboring over something and like getting nothing done. This one is called Tool for Microdesalination, Tool for Island Building, Tool for Fresh Air, and Tool for Melting Ice. So I guess this is 2008, and I'm no longer really overwhelmed by the desire to test my own mortality alone in the desert, so I decided that I'm gonna bring a friend. So the plan was to go from Guadalajara, Mexico to Mexicali, and my friend Veronica Flores is an artist from Guadalajara who decided that she would come with me on this journey. And it was, Mexicali was the original capital of Mexico. It was before Mexico City, chosen by the Aztecs, and because it's actually an island, the sculpture needed to take to the ground and to the water. So it was an interesting design challenge. And it's around this time that I go from sort of resisting possessions and ownership, and from making a single unit that can do everything, to having this fascination for excess and ideas surrounding ownership and for collecting, and especially for mobile collections. And I was working in Chinatown in New York and imagining sort of embellishing the sculptures that I saw around me daily. So oversized shopping carts filled with refuse and bags and locks and umbrellas to keep rain off. And I really wanted to sort of own these sculptures or these structures and to travel in them and to make it work. This is us in the desert and then with sails for the water to get to Mexicali, and that's Mexicali on the right. And that's how it actually worked. So it was a collaboration. And then this is the sort of the resulting sculpture. It's called Everything You Own, Including the Shirt Off My Back. And I think by bringing these sculptures into the gallery, I'm sort of asking myself, what is an art object? And as it moves around the world, how is it recontextualized? And for example, this rickshaw in the West, this image is symbolic of the other, and I'm trying to understand the fetishization of the object here and of the other at the same time, and the idea, I don't know, there's a lot going on, I think. This is another. And this is an island or oasis of stuff in the middle of nature. And I should say, I told you I grew up in a flood-prone area, but I also grew up in the countryside and live in a city, and sort of continuously returning to the island metaphor. I don't know if it's isolation and being surrounded or self-sufficiency versus community, but I just continued to contemplate the idea of the island and mobile living systems. This is called Go Forth and Multiply, and it's an island with a hybrid tree. It grows 4 different fruits. And this is just an archive of island-based prisons. It's very literal. And I think it just came out of thinking about geological borders of the island and the disconnect that people feel. Part of my family is Cuban too, so I was inspired by these boats that were essentially refugee rafts. And the rafts were made by people leaving Cuba for Miami. The one in the far right bottom is the one that I made just as a sculpture. But in 2004, a curator friend and I proposed a project where we invited 60 artists from around the world to send parts of a raft to Miami. We didn't know what to expect. And it was during Art Basel. We assembled the raft on the beach, sort of just an artist initiative project. And we formed just sort of a StoryCorps document of people's responses to the piece, including actually people that had come over from Cuba to Miami, and people with more expertise really taught us how to build a refugee raft a lot better than we did. So that was good. But after that, it actually led us to do other things. So we started to do these mobile projects about water. And this is in Venice at the Biennale in 2005, where, again, artists were invited to install pieces on this vaporetto, and the public just came on. So it was unexpected. People turned away. They didn't want to get on, or people got on and were inundated with this artwork around them. After that, I really started to conceive of a multitude of mobile islands, and was thinking about the water pod as sort of a solution to mobility, property, and affordability of living in New York, creating your own land sort of within the city boundary. So these are images of the design evolution, and basically I wanted to create a means to travel, depict a space based on community, resilience, unexpected collaborations, and sort of one that merged all this off-the-grid living with being in the heart of a city and being surrounded by a community. So the first sketch I had was really a single, or a family unit, and it was everything you needed for an autonomous, sustainable system on the water. So when you're under the water, you have an aquarium view of the East River, and when you're above, then you're in your office space or something like that. And then you have this island infrastructure to keep you upright in a pile to let you go up and down on the tides. You have a fruit tree, and then you can grow vegetables. And then I really imagined those autonomous units being usurped by free trade, especially in New York. And it seems that every utopic quest is sort of usurped by this capitalist experiment. And so anyway, I kept developing the idea and met with Creative Time, an organization based in New York, and met with the Coast Guard and some other groups, and basically was told that the only way to accomplish this project with a minimal budget was to use a pre-existing barge. So I just began outreaching for barges. I understood that it was going to cost too much money to design this structure within the time that I wanted to do it in, so a barge was a good compromise. So I can say really after 6 months of calling up and down the East Coast, even Canada, for a free barge for this great project that was going to happen in New York City, and maybe there would be a lot of press involved. We didn't know. I was so surprised. I kept getting turned down, but finally, after 6 months, I was in touch with the dockmaster of New York, or I was trying to get in touch with the dockmaster of New York. I had a meeting at the mayor's office, and it was sort of in my back pocket. And they said, we're excited about this idea. Come back to us when you have a barge. So I finally started seeing all these articles in the newspaper about abandoned barges being left in the waterways. And I called my connection from that meeting, and I said, I was wondering if you could put me in touch with the dockmaster of New York, because I know that there are a lot of barges that are being abandoned, and maybe there's one that we can fix up for this project. I'm still working on it. And so a day later, the dockmaster called me, and he said, I have this guy, he owes me a favor. So it was the Pyle Foundation. So I go down to meet the dockmaster, we go down to meet the owner of Pyle Foundation under the East River and Bridge, and they're doing this land extension. And the owner of Pyle Foundation says, "Oh, you know, my son just told me all this stuff. He just got back from college. We used to dump oil right into the river, but now I'm really into this green thing, and I'm like, I would love to give you guys this old barge." So the barge is giant, you know, it's the size of a football field. And this is Vancouver-based Lux Effects designed this rendering of what could be done with the barge that size. And I should say, I'm sure you guys know that a project this scale is bound to be full of setbacks. So in February of 2009, right before we were supposed to launch in June, the barge sunk. So it was right before I had almost paid $1 to own it. So I was glad that I gave it a little time. So we found another barge, and this one was a rental. So for $3,600 a month, we rented a barge. And at this point, I had sort of convinced a bunch of my friends to come and live on this water pod with me. So if we did compile all of our rent, it would have been about $3,600. So we figured that it sort of worked out. But this is the new barge. It was donated. It was rented from Weeks Marine. It's 100 feet by 30 feet, so it was much more manageable. And you can see to fit all the living systems on this space and to still have a public space, everything was quite confined. Every inch was accounted for. And just to back step for a minute, it was important throughout the project's beginning, especially to gain support from a wide range of communities, which entailed testifying at hearings to help the Parks Department pull up sunken vessels from the waterways. And it was my job to photograph these vessels as they were being pulled up so they could get support. In turn, they gave us lots of soil and actually a lot of the wood that we ended up using. So then another large part of the project was to plan a course and a route around New York. And it was important to dock at least once in each of the boroughs. And I would love to tell stories about just navigating this vessel through this Kafkaesque bureaucratic system of New York City. It was an undertaking, 48-page contract with the city of New York, with the Department of Parks and Recreation, multiple contracts, I should say, insurance certificates, about 18 permits. It was interesting because at the time, you know, there had never been a project done like this in New York, so the permitting agencies weren't sure whose domain it fell under, and so the solution was to get them all. So finally, with the help of the Coast Guard, we talked the Department of Buildings out of having to give us permits, which probably would have taken another 6 months. But as you'll see with the pictures of the water pod, everything is to a T, to code, so the exit signs are all in the right place. But this is the garden part of the project. This was a big part, because as we're designing a sustainable living system, we're accounting for 4 to 5 people living on the water pod for its 5-month course. And the artist Carissa Carmen led the garden living systems. And she basically outreached through crowdsourcing, through Facebook and other classrooms that she had worked with in the past, to start growing seedlings for us to finally eat. A gray water designer named Tressie Word led the gray water reclamation system, and she came from California to work on the project. And basically the gray water, so the water that we used on the water pod was all rainwater, because if we at first attempted to purify the water from the river, but because we were moving too often, the river water, the makeup of the river waters would always change in our specs. So it was too hard to design a system for that. So it became much easier to just depend on rainwater. And this project was really about depending on the natural resources that were surrounding us. And this made it harder because we had less water to depend on. But in the end, it worked out. And so the rainwater would be purified and gravity fed into a collection tank, which would then go down to the sink and to our shower, and we would drink that water, we would cook with it, we would do our dishes, laundry, and shower. And then whatever water was left over would go through this gray water system, so it would be reclaimed through a natural wetland system, and then we could use that water to water the gardens. Another part of the project was artist Eve K. Tremblay, who's from Canada, took on the role of the artistic curator, and she scheduled artists to arrive in New York to do projects on the water pod. So throughout, we always had this one room that was rotating with a new artist about every week. And found materials actually dictated the design in the end. So collecting materials involved basically locating it first, acquiring and storing it, which was would have been impossible had Allison Ward not been on our team, an artist who worked for an art shipping company. So anytime we could acquire stuff, we would bring it out to Floyd Bennett Field, where the Parks Department had loaned us a storage space. We would leave it there until we were ready to build with it. So the materials that were gathered ranged from billboards to stage sets to wood from old water towers, and also scrap metal. So May of 2009, the flat deck barge was towed from Bayonne, New Jersey to the Brooklyn Navy Yards. And prior to this, we'd had to create relationships with towing companies, legal firms, Department of Parks, Department of Cultural Affairs, and local businesses. Also, people were excited about the project. They wanted to see it happen. They weren't going to, else it would have been an outrageous cost to pull something like this off in New York. And I think for us, it was interesting to think of art in the role of labor and sort of just building your own community at the same time. I have a video that I'll show quickly. So this is just during the build out, just to give you a little idea of what it was actually like.
Work 60 hours a week to afford what we could actually make.
So sometimes we would have 5 volunteers, and then other times we would have about 30 people working with us.
Is a place where 4 artists will live and work, and they'll rotate with different groups of artists and scientists and writers and musicians coming in and staying for 1 week to 1 day. With this project, I think I'm trying to bridge autonomy with community. So you can have an autonomous community. You don't have to be an autonomous separatist. And it actually makes more sense. That's really what I'm finding with this project. When I approached people in the beginning about this idea, people just backed away and said, that sounds like a really great idea, but it's not going to happen in New York. And I think that's a little bit, that pushed me to do it more. And I hope that inspires other people to do things like this more. It doesn't have to be something that's beyond the capabilities of people because of city regulations. And hopefully we'll see more things like this.
Okay, so this is a layout of what the water pod ended up looking like. And clockwise from the small dome that's containing hydroponics and window farms and sub-irrigated planters, that was our greenhouse. Never completely a real greenhouse. We did it in the summer, so it actually never was covered. After that, we come to the second exit gangway. On the top, you can see the shower, the galleys next to it, and then around the corner is a dry composting toilet. Right below that, there are 4 living quarters. And then that big dome is the main space, and there's a chicken coop next to it, and then the gray water tanks are along the bottom. And then right next to that on the left, the very tip, is the potable water tank, It's 1,500 gallons. And then there's all the green areas are garden beds. Okay, so June, finally the water pod begins its 5-month course and visits 8 piers via 2 rivers, a bay, and a sound. Here it is in Harlem. And I think it became this living experiment. I was the only control subject who agreed to stay on there the whole time, and I became just solely dependent on the onboard living systems. So meanwhile, there's hundreds of visitors coming onto the water pod daily, and they're sharing stories, they're bringing gifts, we then included a gifting system, so we felt it wasn't right for us to just stick to what we were growing on board and the chickens laying their eggs. We would also accept the gift of bread that somebody baked for us, so it was really nice. And people started coming on and just surprising us with things that were complete strangers. Because, well, I don't know, during the week it was an open public space, and we worked with the Department of Education to schedule student tours, so you can see them in the middle. There's a picture of a student group, and basically we would give them assignments. So this assignment, they were drawing their own water pod. I think in reality it really became this endurance test and performance project. There was a daily grind that heavily weighed on everybody living on board, sort of cleaning the decks, feeding the chickens, expecting people, tending the gardens, maintaining the gray water system, which ended up having a lot of problems, upgrading the compost and waste treatment technologies. So I don't know, there were difficulties, but it was about this chance, or this chance of people coming on, the daily existence, learning how to take care of this size vessel. And so the gardens contained about 30 different vegetables, from beans to peppers to eggplants, potatoes, tomatoes, kale, broccoli, melons. We had gardening events all the time, and I think people got very excited about making their own gardens. We'd have people come on that decided that they loved it so much they would come back every weekend, and they would host their own classes. One was a man named Bob Highland. He came on the water pod one weekend, decided he liked it so much he was going to teach a class on making sub-irrigation planters, so every weekend he would come back and teach that class, and he had a big following by the end. So we used appropriate technologies from 12-volt solar PV panels. We used batteries and an AC converter, and that's how we powered everything. We used a rocket stove and a solar cooker. We also tried these one laptop per child computers, which supposedly don't use that much power, and they worked pretty well. We had a backup bicycle power system, which which was a lot of work. And there was a sustainable technologies team that was led by Lonnie Grafman, who's from Humboldt. He lives in Humboldt County in California, and he teaches at the college there. So he asked his class if they would participate, and they all built these appropriate technologies for us. He started this website called appropedia.org. So he sources appropriate technologies from all over the world for this site, and so we worked with his students, about once a week. We would Skype with them for an hour as they sort of learned about all the parameters of the project and how to form the appropriate technologies around that. This is a picture at Brooklyn Bridge Park. This is called Big Red in the Sun. That's Allison Ward. They called her Big Red. This is called Universe. This is the kitchen on a rainy day. This is in September at the World's Fair Marina in Queens. So we worked with the Queens Museum, and we hosted several artists' video installations. That was all powered by solar. And this is Concrete Plant Park in the Bronx. So this is Concrete Plant Park as well. And I think I had never really anticipated the kindness of strangers who, for the life of them, could not figure out why we were doing this. But what we saw was wonderful. We witnessed on-board meetings. We saw people that actually came together and started their own green businesses. Multiple partnerships, I think, were results of the project and just meeting on the space. The official count of people coming to visit the water pod was 200,000. So there were, I don't know what that means per day, but it was maybe, I think it's 400 to 500 people a day almost. This was made in Staten Island. This was our third to last stop. And a camera crew came on and just filmed for one day.
The moment I wake up, it's impossible to not become a part of the organism that is made up by all the people, by the plants, by the water, by the sun. It's like every moment that you're on board, you are a part of this system.
I think that the water pod can be a positive solution to something that is very foreseeable in the future, which is lack of resources, lack of clean water, lack of usable land. The water pod is a floating sculptural living system that has 4 residents living and working on board and creating all their food, power, and water to make an autonomous space. This water pod is sort of a fantastical view of a future, and it draws people in and it gets them interested in thinking about all these things on one level or another. When we collect food from the garden, we change the way the garden looks. So any little thing that we do to alter it is mutating the sculpture. So you start with nothing, and then through the collection of lots of talented people, you can slowly start to build something and form something that's a living sculpture. The first model of the water pod, and this is how I initially wanted it to look. So essentially it was a sphere. That one didn't work out practically. It came out to being what it is here. If we did it again, it would be somewhat more like this, and we would have to work with engineers to create this. So it's up to seaworthy standards, but it would be really nice to have this shape, I think. It's a public and a private space at the same time, so when people come on board, we get to tour them through the space and show them what's going on, and you're always open to questions and open to finding solutions for things.
The water pod is participatory, it is technological, it's artistic, it's ecological, it's sustainable, and sometimes those don't match. It's wonderful, it's home.
It's been interesting as a social experiment and dealing with the people you live with in a really intense way, and also dealing with the public is really awesome. It's also about inspiring change in people through art and through ecological design, and so those sort of things are going through my head all the time about how to live in a confined space and be self-sufficient but also have a lot of fun.
We do have wireless internet. We have computers that we use to keep logs and to communicate. So what we hope to do is gather all the data and information from it and put it online in the end so the system can be recreated.
So now we're looking into the future of the water pod and trying to see if we can recreate it in another space, or maybe on land. So I'm just going to talk about 2 more projects that are in process right now. And when I was on the water pod, I became fascinated with the things that you never see from the interior of the city. So the ferries, planes, the cranes. This crane wasn't an uncommon view, and I really thought that it would have made much more sense to sort of form a water pod in a crane instead of on the water. So I started to design something called Flock House, and that was basically thinking about how pre-existing structures could be reused and latched onto and made more dynamic. So I was also thinking about what can happen on rooftops. And after the water pod, a friend of a friend asked what I was going to do with all that equipment. And while I was planning to donate it to people that I already knew needed things, the rest of it, he said, could go to his rooftop. So we have been making plans for what we would actually do on his rooftop, and there are some pictures on the right of how it's going right now, and on the left of how I envision it finally being. And then I began building a modular form, and the form is based on worldwide human migration patterns over the last 5 years, and it's sourced from different internet sources, the Center for Immigration Studies, UNCHR, United Nations University, and so on. So I came up with this shape, and basically it's this migratory inhabitable sculpture that will dock on buildings, towers, and cranes. This is a simplified sketch of what the space looks like. And this is the size, it's quite small. So thinking of migrating habitats, that this would be a pretty small intervention into a city to basically rethink alternatives to urban development in the face of a growing population in cities. So basically harnessing the power of imagination and cooperation and collaboration, I think something similar to the water pod on a smaller scale and maybe in multiples could be designed for a city like New York. And right now I'm working again with the city to make this go around to the 5 boroughs in sort of this very pragmatic yet poetic way, hopefully similar to, but different from the water pod. And finally, this is a project I'll be working on here in Guelph, and it's influenced by, I guess, the assets of multiple voices and collaboration. And so I began redesigning the wearable homes to become wearable cities. And the top layer, essentially, is new, and it can come off of the rest of it, and it's hexagonal, fits it into its neighbor, it sort of hooks together and makes a scalable architecture. This is it on one person, that's it in multiples, and this could be it all attached, sort of creating this overarching architecture that uses art as a vehicle. And I think I'll just close by saying that I'm exponentially passionate about ideas that have the capacity to help human causes, such as food, shelter, and water. And that's it, thanks.